January 7th, 1945. The heart of the Ardennes forest lay buried under 3 feet of snow. Yet inside the British press tent, the atmosphere was nothing short of electric. Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery, the towering figure at the center of it all, stood confidently before a sea of microphones, his sharp, hawk-like features highlighted by the camera flashes. There was a certain arrogance in his smile, not the weary, battle-worn grin of a commander who had just survived one of the bloodiest battles of the war, but an arrogant smirk. It was the kind of look that spoke of a man who firmly believed he was the smartest person in the room, a man convinced that his brilliance was the only thing standing between victory and disaster. He faced the eager reporters and delivered his message as only Montgomery could. The Battle of the Bulge, he claimed, had been one of the most challenging and complicated operations he had ever handled. He spoke of the American troops not as allies, but as children. Children who needed his guidance, his wisdom, and his unparalleled skill. He emphasized the word "I" again and again, as though the entire course of the battle had been a solo performance. He regaled the journalists with a narrative of how the Americans had been on the brink of collapse until he, Montgomery, had arrived to save the day. To the journalists scribbling furiously, it sounded like the speech of a hero, a leader who had single-handedly turned the tide of the war. But 300 meters away, at Supreme Allied Headquarters, General Dwight D. Eisenhower was anything but smiling. In fact, his hands trembled with a cold fury as he held the transcript of Montgomery's speech. Eisenhower, who had played the role of peacemaker for years, had tolerated Montgomery's insults, his brashness, his constant undermining. But today, that patience had run out. Montgomery, in his arrogance, had crossed a line. He had publicly humiliated the Americans, claiming credit for their sacrifices, their bloodshed, and their victories. Eisenhower was done. The lines had been drawn, and now the stakes were higher than ever before. To understand why Montgomery's press conference was the professional equivalent of a suicide note, one must first look at the relationship between the British and American commands. It was an alliance built on necessity, not friendship. On one side was Eisenhower, an American hero who had spent years holding the fragile coalition of Allied forces together. Ike, as he was affectionately known, was a master of consensus, a skilled politician in uniform whose greatest strength lay in his ability to maintain unity amidst the chaos of war. On the other side was Montgomery, a brilliant and methodical strategist who had led British forces to victory in El Alamein, but whose ego was so colossal it often alienated those around him. Montgomery, in his mind, was not a team player. He viewed the war as a stage for his own performance, with himself as the star and everyone else, especially the Americans, playing supporting roles. For months leading up to 1945, the tension had been simmering. Montgomery had become increasingly insistent that he should be in command of all ground forces, effectively demanding that Eisenhower step aside. The Americans were not thrilled with this idea, and Washington had little love for Montgomery, but Winston Churchill, ever the defender of British pride, had repeatedly intervened to shield him. But Eisenhower, ever the diplomat, had protected Montgomery, believing that his tactical genius was worth the headache. The British provided the experience, while the Americans provided the muscle. It was a delicate balance, but by the winter of 1944, that balance was starting to tip. The student had become the master, but the master refused to accept it. And then came the snow. During the frozen weeks of December, Montgomery huddled inside his mobile tactical trailer, surrounded by maps of the Western Front. As the Battle of the Bulge raged on, Montgomery saw incompetence everywhere he looked. American incompetence. He looked at General Omar Bradley's forces, spread too thin, and he saw General George Patton's aggressive approach as reckless and impulsive. In Montgomery's mind, the chaos of the war was a direct result of Eisenhower's broad front strategy. He sat there with his cup of tea, surrounded by portraits of enemy generals he had defeated, convinced that destiny had called him to take charge. Montgomery, in his arrogance, had begun to see himself as indispensable. He believed that the Americans needed him so badly that they would tolerate any insult, any demand, just to keep him on the front lines. He wrote letters to his superiors in London, claiming that the Americans were useless without his guidance, that only he could keep the alliance from unraveling. He wasn't doing this out of malice. He was simply so blinded by his own conviction that he couldn't fathom any other possibility. He believed Eisenhower was too weak, too politically savvy to ever take action against him. But in his arrogance, he overlooked the one thing that would ultimately cost him everything. Even the greatest general is still just a soldier, and every soldier answers to someone. The crisis that would set off this chain of events began on December 16, 1944. The Germans launched a surprise offensive through the Ardennes, initiating the Battle of the Bulge. The attack created a deep wedge in the American lines, separating General Bradley's headquarters in the south from his two armies in the north. Communications were severed, and chaos spread. Eisenhower, faced with an impossible situation, made a difficult decision. He saw that Bradley couldn't effectively command the troops in the north, so he made the pragmatic choice to temporarily place these 200,000 soldiers under Montgomery's command. It was a purely military move, designed to ensure unity of command during a crisis. But for Omar Bradley, this was nothing short of humiliation. Giving up his soldiers to his British rival felt like a demotion. For Patton, it was an act of betrayal. The American generals were furious, but they obeyed the order. They expected Montgomery to act as a caretaker, to respect the American chain of command, and to work with professionalism. Instead, they got a lecture. Montgomery arrived at the American headquarters like a feudal lord inspecting his subjects. He stormed into the operations room of the U.S. First Army, refusing to make eye contact with the American officers who had been working around the clock. He immediately rejected their plans, reorganized their lines, and canceled counterattacks. He spoke to seasoned American generals as though they were cadets who had failed their first exam. "I shall tidy up this mess," he reportedly said, a phrase that burned into the souls of the American staff. He refused to meet Bradley in person, forcing the American commander to come to him. And when they did meet, Montgomery was patronizing, lecturing Bradley on basic tactics while the American general ground his teeth in silence. The atmosphere inside the Allied camp was toxic. American officers began to openly discuss whether they would rather fight the Germans or their own British allies. But Montgomery, oblivious to the growing resentment, mistook their silence for agreement. He mistakenly believed that his success on the battlefield made him untouchable, that his genius justified every insult. He may have stabilized the Northern Front, but in doing so, he alienated his American counterparts to the point of no return. And then came the press conference on January 7, 1945. Montgomery, never one to shy away from the spotlight, stood before the world and delivered a version of events that bordered on the fantastical. He trivialized the horrific struggle of the Battle of the Bulge, a battle in which 19,000 Americans died, by describing it as one of the most interesting and tricky battles he had ever faced. He barely mentioned the heroic defense of Bastogne by the U.S. 101st Airborne and made no mention of Patton's grueling drive from the south. Instead, he painted a picture where the Americans were on the brink of collapse until he, Montgomery, had stepped in to save them. The British press, ever eager for a victory, latched onto Montgomery's narrative, screaming headlines like, "Monty saves the Yanks." But when the news reached General Bradley, the fallout was immediate. He told Eisenhower that he would resign rather than serve under Montgomery again. Patton demanded to be released from his command so he could fight the Germans without Montgomery's interference. The entire American command structure was in revolt, and Montgomery, in his arrogance, had no idea just how badly he had just burned his bridges. Eisenhower, reading the transcript of Montgomery's press conference, knew he could no longer tolerate the British general's behavior. The patience that had been built over years of diplomacy had come to an end. Eisenhower had reached his breaking point, and he was ready to act. The scene in Eisenhower's office was quiet, eerily so. There was no shouting, no confrontation. There was only the sound of a pen scratching across paper as Eisenhower drafted a cable to General George Marshall in Washington. The words he wrote were cold, precise, and final. Eisenhower outlined the breakdown of trust, the unworkability of the current command structure, and, at the end, the ultimatum. If Montgomery's attitude did not change, or if he wasn't removed, Eisenhower would resign. This was not a bluff. Eisenhower was offering the combined chiefs of staff a stark choice. They could have Montgomery, or they could have Eisenhower. The American general was done playing politics, and he was ready to go to the mat. Montgomery's chief of staff, Freddie de Gingen, was summoned to Eisenhower's office to review the ultimatum. As he read the letter, the blood drained from his face. He looked at Eisenhower, who remained stone-faced. Freddie knew that the order was ready to go. Montgomery, the famous field marshal, was about to be removed from command. Freddie rushed to Montgomery's headquarters, and when he arrived, he found Montgomery in his usual good spirits, blissfully unaware of the storm that was brewing. Freddie didn't mince words. He slammed his hand on the table and told Montgomery that Eisenhower was going to fire him. The American general had the full support of Washington and London. For a moment, Montgomery laughed. He couldn't believe it. He thought Eisenhower needed him too much to follow through. But Freddie painted a different picture, a picture where even Churchill could not save him. The reality hit Montgomery like a punch to the gut. The arrogance faded from his face, and for the first time in the war, Montgomery was truly scared. The following morning, Montgomery sent Eisenhower a letter. It was not the usual arrogant missive, but a humble plea for forgiveness. The letter was a total reversal, a complete surrender. "Dear Ike," it began, "I am distressed that my note may have upset you. I am your very devoted subordinate. I promise to do whatever you want." It was a humiliating moment for Montgomery, who had once thought himself untouchable. Eisenhower, ever the professional, read the letter without comment. He didn't gloat, didn't relish the moment. He simply nodded, placed the firing order in his drawer, and replied in the same calm, professional tone. The crisis was averted. The press was told that all was well within the alliance. But privately, the relationship between Montgomery and Eisenhower had been irrevocably shattered. From that day forward, Montgomery remained a hero to the British public. But within the corridors of power, he was a liability. A general who had pushed too hard, too far, and had almost destroyed the unity of the Allied forces. The Battle of the Bulge may have been remembered for its snow, its tanks, and its desperate struggle. But the most dangerous battle was fought with a pen, behind closed doors. Eisenhower's victory over Montgomery wasn't won on the battlefield. It was won by character, by understanding the true nature of leadership. In the high-stakes world of global warfare, brilliance alone is never enough. You must respect the men who fight beside you, or you will lose everything. Montgomery, in his arrogance, learned this lesson too late. The battle for the future of the Allied command was fought, not with guns or tanks, but with an ultimatum. And it was a victory for the United States and for Eisenhower's leadership. If you want to know more about the untold stories of World War II, make sure to like this video, subscribe to WWII Frontline Files, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next gripping story from the front lines. And don't forget to comment and share this video with fellow history buffs who would love to dive into this chapter of WWII history.